Hello, everybody. My name is Buffy Stoll Turton, and I am delighted to talk with you all today about my recently completed dissertation research and something that I believe is a really important topic for all of us in student affairs to be talking, or continuing really to talk about, which is the experience of first-generation students. And so as you can see, my focus is really on the success stories of first-gen students and how they navigate a tension between home and school. And to give you a little bit of an overview of our session. Let's see. There we go. I'm going to first introduce a little bit about where I'm coming from pretty quickly, and also quickly give you an overview of a couple of important points about first-generation students. Then I'll tell you about my study and the three types of tension that I describe in my findings. And those are the tension of transition, the tension of identity, and the tension of success. Where I want to spend the most time in this presentation is exploring those types of tension and weaving some of the stories of the students that participated in my research, and then moving on to ideas for application. I am not myself a full-time residence life professional, but I've worked really closely in my 15 years in higher ed with partners in residence life. In fact, my former partner was a res life professional, so I've also experienced living in several different halls at an urban campus, which is not the one I'm at now. So I want to really make sure that we have some time in this hour to connect some of the application parts of my research to your residence life context. And I think that lots of the things that I write about, even in my dissertation, though it wasn't focused specifically on a res life context or a res life application, are really easily applicable. And I'm eager to engage with you and answer any questions that you have. So I'd encourage you throughout the presentation to go ahead and submit questions as soon as you've got them. And I'm happy to, I can be a pretty informal kind of presenter. I'm happy to address those as they come in. So a little bit about me. I really identify as a storyteller. That picture is not me, but I like it. All of these were free stock photo images, in fact. So, but I like that photo because it has to do with adventure, and it looks like there's something going on that I want to know about in that photo. So my roots as a storyteller stem from growing up in Appalachia, where I was always surrounded by a lot of oral histories. And that was something that resonated with me as I encountered my dissertation research. And there was never a question that I was going to be a qualitative researcher. I appreciate the numerical data that really paves the path for a lot of the new topics that we encounter. And certainly there was a lot of quantitative research on first-gen students in the earlier years of exploring this topic. And now I'm happy to contribute some stories of students in my qualitative research. I am not myself a first-generation student, but I departed from the path that my parents led when they went to college. My dad, I think, did maybe a year in college before he went ahead and went another direction, but my mom was sort of my educational role model, and she was herself an educator. But she also got married when she was 19, made her own wedding dress, had the ceremony in my grandparents' living room, and really the entire time she was in college, she was a wife in a really traditional sense. So as I was growing up, even though I really admired her path through higher ed, I didn't ever have much in common with either of my parents' experiences as college students. I went to a more traditional four-year school, lived on campus, did the student activities, and of course, you know, some of those led me to student affairs as a career. And some of those questions and some of those realizations as I was studying in my master's degree helped me start to realize that my path was really very different than my parents' path, and that resulted in some tension between home and school for me. So that led me to wonder about first-generation students, and my story really is what piqued my interest in first-generation students and my admiration of this population as a whole. So just a little bit about first-generation students. I might assume that many of the folks on the call are familiar with, first-generation students as a population. There's lots of different ways to define first-gen students. Most often our institutions are going to take the most liberal definition so that we can include the largest number of students in those populations as we're defining and serving them, and also advertising that we have large numbers of first-gen students, which is attractive for an admission office to be able to do. But you can also, so many of our institutions will say that first-gen students are folks whose parents don't have bachelor's degrees. I took a little bit more of a conservative definition in my study and defined first-gen students as those whose parents never went to a 4-year school. That was more relevant to the research questions that I was pursuing. But higher ed as a whole has been talking about first-gen students for at least the past 2 decades. Some of the earliest research goes back to the 1980s. But the Department of Education at a federal level got involved and did several large studies, quantitative studies, between 2000 and 2010. And so since those studies in particular, but lots of other ones too, have laid a groundwork for understanding some information about first-gen students, like that they have lower rates of persistence, that they're more likely to come from a lower socioeconomic background, that they're less likely to be involved on campus. All these bullets that I've got there that you can read too, that they fall into many of these marginalized populations. Lots of more recent research on first-generation students like mine really gets at some of the complexities and nuances of the experiences of this population, and that's where my information comes in. So a little bit more detail about some of these statistics. In terms of lower persistence, in a Tinto and Engel study in 2008, that was one of those that was commissioned at a federal level. They found that after 6 years, only 11% of low-income first-gen students had earned their bachelor's degrees, compared to 55% of their more advantaged peers. And that's a pretty drastic difference. In terms of socioeconomic status, 1 in 4 college students across all post-secondary institutions, so both 2 and 4 years, is first-gen and low income being defined as a family income less than $25,000. I think that gets to a little bit of a lower rate when we just look at 4-year institutions, but that underscores the numbers of first-gen students who are pursuing higher ed and that we are encountering, whether we know it or not, in our work and in our institutions. And that last bullet there about first-gen students is that this idea about navigating between the worlds of home and school. This is really where it gets to the point of what my interest and my focus was in the research that I've done. I wanted to find, we can acknowledge all of the statistics that really cast first-gen students, I think, as a deficient population. And I mean, the numbers are the numbers. But I think that sometimes those numbers lead us to understand first-generation students as a population of students that needs fixed. So I wanted to resist that idea and really take a little bit, if not neutral, actually a really more supportive and affirming stance in investigating the experiences of first-gen students as they're navigating between these worlds of home and school, because lots of the studies that have been done focus only on how first-gen students are encountering the campus environment. And so I wanted to widen that lens because their home environments and the impact and the influence of their worlds at home, I think, are an important part of how all college students encounter their college experiences, and perhaps even more drastically important for first-gen students. So a little bit more detail about my study. There were 8 participants. I talked with 4 seniors at Miami University, so that part's not a secret. I think I didn't have to say there was a mid-sized public institution, and then you can look and see where I work and know that it's pretty much the same thing. But it's not a secret, and in fact, I think that the context of Miami is a really important part of understanding the experiences of these 8 seniors that I spent an entire year speaking with. I did 4 interviews with each of them and followed them from September to May when each of them graduated. And this was in 2013, 2014. So they've now been out of school for a full year and a half, and many of them are doing quite well. But it was just a joy to be able to get to know these students. So Miami in Ohio, you all know that because of the Glucujo region. So we're mid-sized public residential. In fact, there is a 2-year residency requirement for students on our campus. And mid-sized meaning we're about 16,000 undergrads, and 18% of those incoming students when these participants came in, so that was the fall of 2010, 18% of our class was first gen. It has since declined a bit. I think the most recent numbers were down to 14%. And so that gives you a little bit of an understanding of the company that these students were in during their 4 years at Miami. One student was a 5-year student. The focus of my research questions really wanted to discover the stories that successful, emphasis there, successful first-gen students were telling about their experiences of navigating tension between home and school. Knowing that, well, making an assumption that the world of home is quite different, especially for these students whose families had never pursued a college degree at a 4-year institution. So they were truly having a unique experience. And then I wanted to see how those first-gen students' experiences of tension really shifted or changed as they shifted and changed throughout college. So I'm operating with a baseline assumption that participants are experiencing some tension between home and school. That assumption then was affirmed by one of the criterion for student participation in the study. I might anticipate that most every student, first gen or not, experiences some sort of tension between home and school during their years in college, and it was actually a very, very simple question for the participants to answer, and each of them quickly said, yes, I have experienced tension, and then we went from there. Here's a look at the participants in my study. And I want to make sure that I acknowledge that, as all qualitative research tends to need to do, and it's important, that these 8 students are not designed to be representative of larger populations. Rather, looking deeply into their stories with lots of context and lots of rich description can help you make a decision about whether the stories that I can share about the research that I've done can be relevant in the context of your campus and your work. So that disclaimer there, I do not intend for these stories to be widely generalizable. That decision is up to you to make about how relevant they are in your context. So you can see that, and these are all pseudonyms. Some people sometimes ask about the pseudonym of the black sheep. That was the pseudonym that he wanted to choose, and so I supported him there. And so we've got 5 women and 3 men, and got 3 white or Caucasian students and 5 students who are non-white from several different kinds of backgrounds, and also a breadth of majors and focus areas in their studies. One of the things that was interesting to me as I started to hear more about these student stories was that there were many more liberal ed or non-science-y majors than I had anticipated. And that was something that ended up contributing to some of the tension later on between home and school. There were some consistent observations across these 8 stories which disrupted some of my assumptions about first-gen students. I had heard stories about students really persisting to college amidst objections from families, or outright feelings of home as being betrayed by students who are leaving to go on to college. and perhaps some of that, that I didn't see that in the students that I worked with, relates to the kind of institution that I'm working with, right? A relatively traditional institution. And we have a reputation for not being particularly diverse in terms of race and socioeconomic status. And I don't think, I mean, I think that reputation is pretty well founded. There's data to support that, you know, these students were in the minority for being first gen and several of their other identities, including lower socioeconomic status. All of these students had planned to go to college from a young age. They told lots of stories about being a little kid and knowing that they wanted to be something that required lots of studying, that they wanted to do something that was different than what they saw their parents and their family doing. And they got encouragement from their families. Some of them told stories about their families telling them, you're going to go to college. And so that disrupted a little bit of my assumptions, and I think is important to just keep in mind as we tell some of these stories of these students. All the students talked about wanting to be far enough away from home. Nobody was from we are in a pretty small town, but every student was at least from 1 hour away. And here they were recognizing a need for separation. They wanted to be at least a bit independent from their families, but not too far away. This was an important qualification because many of the students acknowledged that something could happen at home that they needed to be able to get back to. Not that family needed to be able to get to campus to support them, but that they, as the source of the support, may need to go home and take care of something for someone else. All or nearly all of these students also had encountered really particular experiences of independence before coming to college. Imani told a story about moving out of her parents' house for her entire senior year of high school because of a disagreement about her boyfriend that her parents really didn't approve of. She lived with her grandparents, which was 45 minutes away from her parents, and her dad and brother didn't come to her high school graduation. And this was something that was really significant for Imani because she was really operating in a way that was extremely independent from her family for most of her senior year of high school. In fact, she and her dad didn't even speak until halfway through her first semester of college here at Miami. James was one of 3 students from immigrant families in this study. His parents moved to the States from Taiwan when, well, he might have been born here, actually. They moved here just before he was born. Imani's family moved here when she was 3 years old, and Emma immigrated with her family to the States when she was 12, and she did not know a lick of English. She's in an 8th grade classroom knowing, and she tells the story about knowing that she needs to go to college because that's where she's going to get the education that's going to lead her to her career. She never anticipated moving to the States, and so she's you know, put in a completely different environment where she does not speak the language, and that was, you know, part of her independent experience. James was, even though his family moved here before he was born, was the oldest English speaker in his family. Jade, who was from an urban area about an hour from college, from our campus here, operated as a caretaker for her younger sister because her mom was sick. John's mother was incarcerated for a year, and his father was institutionalized in a different way for mental health concerns. And so he lived with his sisters for a year while his mother was incarcerated. And so some really amazing and unexpected stories to illustrate some of the ways that these students had operated in extreme independence before they ever got to college. And these are the stories that I think are really important to understanding individual students that we might not expect or might not know to make space for when we encounter students in our halls, in our programs, and in our classes. So each of these students had had really powerful experiences and stories in their worlds at home, but how would they encounter this very traditional college world when they got to Miami. So now I want to really launch into these 3 types of tension that I observed between home and school from the participants' stories. So the first is the tension of transition. So we've got that far enough away piece, right? That they didn't want, some of that transition tension was prompted by the students. They're like, I don't want to go to school in my hometown, even though that might have been more convenient for their families. And even some of the students who came from just an hour away, their families would have preferred if they had lived at home and commuted to school. But each of these students also lived on campus. And I didn't, even though it was okay, it would have been okay for a commuter student to participate in the study, I didn't have any commuter students in the participants here. What's interesting is that many of these students in their transition experienced being first gen as a pretty invisible identity. And that allowed other students and other folks in their experiences to make some assumptions about who they were and where they came from. Colleen, who was from a rural Ohio town a couple hours away from campus here, talks about being nervous about move-in day. She rolls up on move-in day, and they've got, a 4-door sedan, and she's observing that many of the other students have SUVs, some people have U-Hauls, and she's feeling a little humble about what they've got even before they get out of the car. So they pull up to the curb, and of course there are lots of students ready to help. She opens the door, they pop the trunk, and the first thing that a student said to her was, "Is this all you've got?" And Colleen inside is going a little crazy. That student was making a big assumption about who Colleen was, and in trying to be, very, very polite. I'm not sure how that other student would have known that no, she doesn't have more stuff. In fact, they had been anxious for months, Colleen and her mom in particular, about what to pack, what to bring, what do you get. They got the Bed Bath & Beyond list, but they were like, really, all of that stuff? So they packed what they thought they needed, and immediately that gets questioned within minutes after arriving on campus. So of course, they unload pretty quickly, and Colleen's mom says, we're going to Walmart, and they walked around Walmart looking at what the other people were buying because they didn't know what it was that they were missing. They just knew that they didn't have what other people expected them to have. That was a really powerful story for me, and Colleen really was still vivid for her, even in her senior year, to relive this move-in day that was pretty significant for her. So this invisible identity could be of different levels of salience for different students. Some students in this study were not even conscious of being a first-gen student until they got my invitation to participate in the study and read the criteria and responded to me via email to say, I guess I'm a first-gen student. I'm happy to share my story. Other students really understood very much that they were first-gen students, and some of them were pretty proud of it. Jade was one example of a student who was really proud of her first-gen identity. And I find, and I've seen this in literature too, that the first-gen identity is often more salient when it's combined with other marginalized identities. And that can really enhance feelings of cultural dissonance. I want to talk about cultural dissonance a little bit because I think that this is important in terms of students adjusting or transitioning. I like the word transitioning versus adjusting, and certainly not using words like, oh, there's an I word that of course is escaping me right now, that really just means taking on the culture of the university and letting your own go, right? Cultural dissonance is a reality for first-gen students and students from other minority backgrounds because the university is often not designed to welcome these students and their histories and contexts and stories and cultures. In fact, in general, we see in predominant retention theories like Tinto, ideas that integrating into the university. Oh, assimilating, that's the word that rubs me the wrong way, right? That integrating into the university means disintegrating from home. That can be problematic for students whose cultural contexts differ significantly from the culture of the university. And there are some important scholars who write about first-generation students in particular, and first-generation students of color, who advocate that these students need to maintain a sense of integrity as they adjust to the university context, so that they can then discover and create spaces on campus where they feel at home, with the sustained support and connection to those communities at home, so that their transition to the college culture is a more gradual one than students whose cultures at home are more consistent with that of their campuses. All right. Intersectional identities, I think, is something also to think about here, and that really contributes to that cultural dissonance conversation and enhancing that cultural dissonance. And in fact, a couple of observations in the students' stories that I worked with. John was the only white male in the study, and perhaps coincidentally, but perhaps not, he was motivated more motivated than many of the others to assimilate into this majority culture when he showed up to the admission office and there's nice cars all around, and he's driving the same, with his mom, an old car that some students might say, oh, I was embarrassed to drive up. John looked at those other cars and said, that's going to be me someday. But other students, like the black sheep, like Emma, who emigrated to the U.S. at age 12, like Colleen from her rural background, they felt pretty challenged by this majority culture. And Imani, the Latina student who moved to the U.S. when she was 3, she wanted to blend in at first, but then as she became more comfortable with her college identity, she was more encouraged to make that differentiation of herself and her culture. One observation about the tension of transition that these students encountered is that their social adjustments were more pronounced than their academic adjustments. And perhaps that could be a factor that I'm talking to seniors, and so anybody who had really big academic issues perhaps didn't persist, right? So I want to acknowledge that. But it's interesting that lots of new students at Miami, including, we're doing a transition survey on our campus right now, and some of the early observations from that survey indicate stress in students making new friends on this campus, and perhaps that's a generational observation as well. Or perhaps as they're looking back from their senior year, the social struggles are the ones that remain more salient, whereas if students have resolved some of their academic challenges, then those don't stand out as much. Let's see. In terms of mentors, I want to stress the impact here. And of course, it's easy to understand that mentors have a positive impact, but the additional nuance for these first-gen students is that they were never going to ask for a mentor. They happened into mentoring relationships with faculty and staff. One of my favorite stories to illustrate this experience is from John, who knew that he needed a job on campus, applied and was hired before he even arrived on on move-in day, and in fact, he arrived and participated in a pre-semester experience for diverse students. So he identified as somebody from a low socioeconomic background, identified as a first-generation student, and arrived about 3 days before normal first-year move-in. He went to introduce himself to his supervisor at his campus job and walked right in to the dean's office in the space where he was working. Now, the dean was not going to be his direct supervisor, but the dean was gracious in sort of rolling with John's, I don't know if you call it a mistake. It really ended up being what I call serendipitous naivete. Right? John didn't know what not to do. And that is an illustration of how sometimes the strengths and experiences of first-generation students in not knowing what to be afraid of or not knowing how to limit themselves could actually be an advantage. And resisting this deficient view of first-gen students as not knowing what's going on, or as there's one phrase that folks use about first-gen students is students without code books, right? They don't know what to do. Well, they don't know what not to do. And in John's case, this turned into a really serendipitous connection with this dean who sat him down and said, tell me about yourself. And the dean was himself had himself been a first-generation student and made a really valuable connection with John that John never would have asked for. And in fact, John talked about how he didn't deserve that opportunity and that benefit. And so sometimes mentoring can be a challenging structure to create, because how do we get students to respond to an invitation? How do we, follow up on some organically developing opportunities and relationships that might happen? And that's what happened, in the cases of the students that, of the stories that they shared with me, is that, lots of these mentoring relationships were really serendipitous stumble-upons, not a part of a larger program where they were told, hey, here's your mentor, you can now talk with this person. So they really got pretty lucky in connecting with some of these important sources of validation. Validation is a really key component, I think, of supporting first-gen students. And I discovered, and I couldn't understand why I had never had the opportunity to learn about this in grad school, but the Laura Rendon's validation theory comes very much into play here. And it's a pretty simple concept, right? That these students are not going to step out and self-advocate by and large, but that validating messages and relationships and experiences both inside and outside of the classroom really can bolster the success of non-traditional students at large and low-income and first-generation students in particular, and especially as they're transitioning. That one person, that dean, who turned into a mentor for John made that difference. Imani, the Latina student who had, and I know that these names, and I'm not sure how much everybody else remembers the names of the students of these stories, but Imani was a psych major and came in with another major. I forget what her first major was, but she was really not sure exactly what she wanted to study and wasn't having a great first semester in terms of academic success. Well, she'd always been interested in a particular international area of the world, and somebody sent her an email that included a info session for a study abroad experience, and her serendipitous naivete / mentoring experience was a connection with the faculty who was leading that study abroad experience. And her attending that session and not knowing as a first year that it was really unusual for folks to study abroad in the fall of their sophomore year, she walked right into that session, and the faculty member cleared some roadblocks for her, including some financial ones that helped her study abroad halfway across the world in a totally different setting. And she went to Southeast Asia to study abroad, and turned out to be a hallmark of her college experience. And they did these things without asking permission from home. Imani, when she made that decision to study abroad, called her parents and told them afterward. She'd already signed the paperwork, and they didn't know what to say. Well, they actually had lots to say about it, but they didn't. Her family didn't have the capital and the empowerment within the college context to say, no, you can't do that, because she was going to make it happen, and she did, and it was a really exciting story. And the last piece that is relevant to the tension of transition here is the motivation of these students to pursue long-term goals. And this seems different in my non-scientific observations with non-first-gen students who tend to be, in my humble opinion, more focused on shorter-term realities. But these first-gen students had a really long view of the and a deeper sense of why they were here at college. Perhaps this isn't surprising, right? They knew, and they're motivated by the distinct differences between home and school, because they're very pursuing a college education is by its nature distinguishing themselves from the history and the context of their families, even if those first-gen students intended on going back home to contribute to their local communities after they finished college. And so they were, I think that their long-term goals and their focus there tended to help them weather some of these other challenges in ways that would have been harder, I think, if they had been less inspired by this bigger idea of graduating from college and making a difference in their careers and in their families and their communities. Tension of identity was a second piece to that really emerged, right? Tension of transition is really not a huge surprise, right? Lots of college students, first gen or not, experience a tension when they're transitioning to college. It's just distinct for these first generation students in the ways I've just described. But as they continued and persisted through their first semesters and their first years, they began to gain a sense of college as their identity, a college sense of self, if you will. And a sense of self even more particular in this college context. In this context at Miami that is largely white, largely middle to maybe even upper middle class, largely there's a lot of students here who are legacies or who have other family members who have attended Miami. It's a very sort of in-group kind of experience. And so as these first-gen students found their place in lots of different ways, they began to incorporate this campus, this university, as a part of who they were and how, and a force for shaping their experience and their life in a bigger sense. They found comfortable and authentic people in spaces, but not always necessarily easily. Some did that more quickly than others. And some certainly found those comfortable spaces in their residence halls. Some struggled with the residence hall in particular as an environment that they did not feel included in, not necessarily as a result of the structure and the leadership within the hall, but just as a result of not identifying with other students. So Colleen's story, after she has this move-in debacle, that might be a strong word, this move-in, I don't know, issue maybe. So she gets to her room, and I said that she's from a pretty rural environment, a few hours away in Ohio. She meets her roommate, who is from the middle of Washington, D.C., whose parents are diplomats, whose dad grew up in Europe. And she is completely dumbfounded because Colleen is looking at her roommate as what college is supposed to be, what a college student should be. And she continues throughout the first weeks of the fall semester to observe her roommate's actions as an ideal of the way that college should be done. Colleen was an amazingly intelligent student. Colleen was here on full academic scholarship in the honors program. So was her roommate, actually. And so it's not that she wasn't capable of thinking of it. It was simply that the cultural dissonance was so vast for her, and her identity was so outside of the identities that she was seeing, really epitomized by her roommate, with whom she really had nothing in common. She couldn't make that connection. But she also didn't feel empowered, again with the mentor piece, she didn't feel empowered to reach out because she didn't want to distinguish herself. So there was a desire to not really ask her RA, for example. And so Colleen really struggled with that transition for quite a while until her grandmother, who she often called for advice, asked her, how long do you have to live with this person? And Colleen says, well, I guess until the end of the academic year. And her grandmother says to her, well, you better stop acting like a baby and have a conversation with her. And shortly thereafter, Colleen and her roommate made a connection over the TV show The Nanny, which has some ironic parallels if you're familiar with that show in the first place. And Colleen describes a realization that there was more than one way to go about succeeding at college. And from that point, Colleen was able to accept a college piece of her own identity, even though she went about succeeding at college in ways that were really different from the way that her roommate did. In some of these cases, their identity development really prompted further tension, right? So in Jade's case, she began, her sort of discovery of self at college had to do with connecting with the Women's Center on campus. And Jade began to discover what feminism was all about and what that looked like in college. Jade herself became an RA, and then was like, ooh, this is a thing that I can enact. Her feminist self was something that she could incorporate into her own leadership. And then she's got residents who are looking up to her, and then she's further empowered not only as a feminist but as a leader on campus, and she was really jazzed. But this meant that she had to renegotiate how she was transitioning in the larger college context. Her friend group changed, and some of the ways that some of the tension that she experienced, some of the identity development prompted some tension with home, because Jade's family and her home world was not at all down with feminist ways of thinking, was not at all really champions for social justice in some of the same ways that Jade began to value, particularly in valuing LGBT identities. That was something that Jade really re-encountered a tension for, and illustrates how these tensions of transition, identity, and success are not really a linear journey, but really can be experienced in recursive ways. So Jade describes actually censoring herself at home as she became more incorporated with what was happening in the college world and her college self. She says that she had an old Jade, which was the home Jade, and a new Jade, which was the Jade that she was when she was here on campus. And then I skipped a little bit this idea about not every environment is friendly. And the point I want to make there is that these students were still able to navigate some of the transition and identity development at college, despite some environments that really weren't welcoming to them at all. Some students encountered some microaggressions and even outright racism. James, who was the Asian American student, walked down the street in our local town and had racial slurs said out loud from strangers, which is really just frightening. The black sheep, an African American student, grew out his afro, maybe in his first year, and in class, he always sat in the front row. In class, a professor actually patted him on the head. And this was really not at all friendly for these students, right? Those were invalidating experiences. Let's move on quickly to attention of success, which really relates a bit to students' later years in their college experiences, but not necessarily only in those years. Because, of course, by being just in college at all, these were the most educationally successful students in their families. People looked up to them, right? But oftentimes, that looking up turned into requests from support at home. And some of that was emotional support, and some of that was sort of just being present in ways that were consistent with students' expectations. But some of that actually was requests for material support at home. Both John and the black sheep had family members at home who were asking them to send money from their work-study checks, from their loan refunds, to support family members And they eventually had to make some difficult choices about whether they were going to continue to do that based on the decisions that they saw those family members making with the money that they did send at first. This tension of success then turned into a challenge of translating their experience. Oftentimes the family members weren't super comfortable on campus, even though, and sometimes the students weren't that excited about having their family members here. But I think more often it was the family members who were like, nope, that's your world. And so then it was difficult for these students to explain how, what they were learning at college. Many of them did get support, either emotionally or materially, from their family members, and they were appreciative of that support. But it was pretty difficult sometimes to describe all that they had learned and gained. Emma, in her senior year, Emma was an interior design major, and she had a senior show that showcased the work that she had been doing, and her family was not, and they were non-English speakers. They just weren't comfortable on campus. I think they went for maybe 10 minutes. And then many of these families also had their own work schedules and demands on their own lives and experiences. So sometimes they just weren't always available to, be here to participate in person in their students' experiences. And then some of the tension of success really started to emerge in students' decisions regarding careers. So families, when they thought about what success was and what they wanted for their student, their understanding of the purpose of going to college was to become independent. You go and you pay your own bills, and you're supporting yourself, even still maintaining connections to families, which was important to many of the sort of larger family groups of these students. But what mom and dad wanted is you get a job, and so that you can become financially self-sufficient. Well, students, you saw all those liberal education majors that they've got. They're majoring in the social sciences, right? And international studies as a major can be difficult to translate into, like, what if there isn't a job? And in fact, the job search process was something that was particularly challenging for many of these first-generation students because they had been focused on graduating, not job searching, not getting an internship in your sophomore summer, not gaining practical experience. Most of the jobs that they had outside of class were purely to support themselves financially, and almost all of them had at least one job, but they weren't jobs that were connected to their career development. So that meant that they had a really sharp learning curve about the time that they started looking for jobs in the fall, maybe a late fall of their senior year. Now, a couple of these students did go on to graduate school, and again, those searches started a little bit late, in my opinion. I remember talking to Colleen, our academic superstar, in November and December that year about where she might want to go to grad school and what programs she went for. Her story has a beautiful ending as well. She's finished a master's degree and is now in law school. So she figured it out, but that learning curve was much sharper than what they saw their friends doing, partly because they also observed that some of their friends had some additional career resources through their non-first-gen parents and family members who would hook them up with that internship, who would connect them with those networking resources that led to some of these things. And so that turns into one of the takeaways, I think, from the study here, and big recommendations that, from my perspective, is that we really have got to be focusing more on the junior and senior experiences, perhaps sophomore, right? So that we're equipping early on first-gen students with career resources and career exploration, because it's possible that, like the students in my study, they're primarily concerned with getting that degree. They have that long-term goal, but and many of the students in my study knew what they wanted to do, but they didn't know exactly how to make that study, their college experience, turn into that career. Other takeaways: resisting deficient perspectives, really engaging that validation theory. I'd really encourage anybody who is interested to read more about Laura Rendon's validation theory, and communicate that message that there are multiple ways to succeed at college, which is not something that is necessarily intuitive for our first-gen students. Valuing their knowledge, understanding that the goal is not to conform to the university culture, but to gain ownership in their own way over the college experience. I think that we've got some work to do in the language that our institutions use and our default to the way that we lean into competitive and individualistic ways of knowing and speaking and operating, which can sometimes clash. There's a very interesting article called Unseen Disadvantage that describes the ways that first-gen students' modes of operating in collectivistic and cooperative terms can often clash with these individualistic and competitive modes and cultures in the institutional context, particularly in four-year, more competitive institutions. Structured involvement and connection, like the mentoring stuff that I described as experiences. We need programs that tell students, hey, this is the person that you're going to be connecting with, right? And this is the person who's trained to, by the way, who's also been trained to, offer validation and to listen to student stories. The study abroad and pre-semester retreats really resonated, especially in terms of Imani's study abroad experience, in terms of John's pre-semester program that he attended, which was that pre-semester program that John attended included several other students from his residence hall, and his best friends came from his residence hall because he also knew that they got him, that they attended this program specifically for diverse students as well, and they were really able to connect in ways that were lasting throughout his 4 years. And speaking of lasting beyond the 4 years, right, that first year is just the beginning. And these tensions grow and shift and change and do not dissipate, but evolve across first-gen students' experiences in college, or at least for these 8 students. And I might suggest that it's possible that they do that for other folks too. When I say consider program design carefully, I'm thinking about the ways that we might isolate first-gen students in targeting services and programs, perhaps a living learning community, perhaps an entire hall. I know that the University of Cincinnati has a first-generation student house, and I'm not pro or con in all situations. I think it's really important to consider context of an institution to question whether targeted services and support, particularly for first-gen students, would have the effect of isolating or would have the effect of supporting that student population as something that is special and distinct. I ran for a few years here a transition course, 1-credit course for first-gen students, but we had to really design our language carefully so that we were speaking inclusively about supportive and collaborative context instead of this is something that you need because otherwise you would be at risk. Providing space for reflection and really being able to help these students feel safe in ways, in spaces where they can be their authentic selves. And I think that residence halls are an obvious location for some of that reflection to happen in groups or in just individual dialogues, one-on-one, perhaps with an RA or another peer leader in the hall. But really allowing the rest of the community to also acknowledge and affirm that there are multiple paths to succeed in college, because the students in this study found their opportunity to tell their story in itself a validating experience. And I think all of these things will really help us move forward in transforming institutional culture to be places that by default are validating instead of providing invalidation and discontinuity, that we're really welcoming these students and engaging them as individuals with their stories in ways that can be additionally supportive of their success. So that took a while, and I'm not sure if folks are able to stick around. I've got some time to answer additional questions, but I totally understand if you need to take off. And so I'll hang out for a couple of minutes and happy to talk further if folks have questions.
Okay, everybody, if you'd like to submit a question, you can do so at this time. Just pull up the chat box on your GoToWebinar control panel and please type your question. We'll send those over and get them answered for you. We'll hang out for just a couple more minutes, and if there are no questions, then we'll go ahead and end the webinar.
I see that question about, yep, the theorist that I mentioned here. Oh, look at that. I will have to, Eric, if you don't mind, I'll have to add her information to my references. But it's actually on the screen that you see right here where it says Enrollment Management Journal. Now, you can look up Laura Rendon, R-E-N-D-O-N. She is currently a faculty member at University of Texas, San Antonio. And she's written some articles on validation theory, and some of this dates back, the first stuff dates back to the 90s, but that Enrollment Management Journal from 2011 is entirely about validation theory. And so she writes pieces of that, and there's also information of other folks who are writing about validation theory as well. So thanks, Matea, for your question. So Portia, your question about targeted services and resources is, I think, on point, right? So I'm curious about what pieces of your institutional context lead you to oppose, doing some of these targeted programs. Some of it is going to depend on what the nature of the programs is, but you can find, let's see, there is a fascinating article on living learning communities for first-generation students, and I'd be happy to provide that separately because I don't think it's here in my list. But I think that sometimes these things can be appropriate. So my first thing would be to ask you to consider the pieces that rub you the wrong way, right? That make you not in favor of targeted support services. My campus just opted out of doing a targeted course experience for first-gen students, and I was a little bit sad that they did that because I sort of wanted to teach it. Because I feel like sometimes when we have some targeted support services, that we're creating opportunities for those students to connect with affirming and validating faculty, staff, peer leaders, folks who can effectively operate as mentors in their experiences. And one really just sort of quick and dirty way that I approach language when we communicated to students in the past. So our current approach to transition courses no longer distinguishes first-gen students, but I used to have a very non-mandatory course where we pre-enrolled first-gen students and allowed them to drop if they wanted to. And when we reached out to them to say, we've pre-enrolled you in this course, we would say that there are several populations of students at Miami that, for which we offer targeted support. And one of those other populations, for example, is honor students, right? And the connotation that folks have about honor students being special and intelligent and, not at all deficient, I think was a really helpful comparison. So, quite frankly, we would say, hey, like honor students, you have this opportunity to take advantage of this additional help. Being very careful about saying, in order for you to succeed, you need this, right? Which communicates tacitly a message that they can't do it on their own. But rather saying that you're excited to or prepared to contribute, and we want to help you do that even more, right? So perhaps that baseline thing. We also use athletes as another comparison group, right? So that there is a little bit of context that we're adding there. So Matea, I'm seeing your question about the students offering applications. Do you mean if you mean for my study, no, I reached out to the students and invited them to participate in my study. Our institutional research folks here polled every first-gen student who started in the fall of 2010, which would have made them seniors if they were on a 4-year plan. And then they sent that email out for me because they wouldn't release their emails to me. Even though I had them all because of my full-time job, I couldn't use them in my role as a student. And so they sent that email on my behalf, and then the students contacted me to participate in this study. So I hope that answered your question, Matea. If not, then please feel free. I'm sorry for misinterpreting, so I'm seeing the additional ones. I asked the students in our last interview about what their advice and for student affairs in general or any particular piece. Many of them underscored the importance of that pre-semester experience where they had the opportunity to connect with other diverse students. And that program of ours, if you want to look more up about it, it's called MADE, M-A-D-E, at Miami. MADE is an acronym that stands for Mentoring, Achievement, Diversity, and Excellence. And anybody can attend, but it's advertised as a program for students with diverse identities and sort of loosely applied. But gosh, at least half of the students in my study attended MADE at Miami and had great things to say about it because they were targeting validating messages that were happening, that were being communicated through leaders in the university, including from our Diversity Affairs office, but not limited to that office, through that program. So they really endorsed that program. And by and large, the other advice that they offered, was sort of more philosophical in nature, like, hey, you should give everybody this chance to tell their story. And many of them said, I wish that I had had a chance to do this for a longer period of time. I'm like, ooh, cool, my next research project. But that would be certainly time intensive for staff or researchers. But it translates to me in terms of application into let's look for any opportunities to help make space for these students to operate in a safe space where they can be their authentic selves and recognize that their home contexts and their paths are really important, regardless of the health of the relationship at home. Their past and their histories for all students are often informing what they want to study at school and are very relevant to their college experience, and in fact should not be just left at home when they cross the threshold onto our campuses. Portia, I'm reading your latest question here, your second one. Portia, I would refer you to Roshni Jahangir's work. She's not specifically focused on Latina students, but she's at the University of Minnesota with a high immigrant population and a really diverse student body. And she talks about a living learning community, actually, I believe, for first-gen students. And for her, sometimes first-gen also means first-generation immigrant, since they have many Hmong students who are there in the Minneapolis area. And I want to say that there's another researcher who I'm going to try and think of here. And it's not going to come to me. But there is a little bit more information out there about Latina first-gen students in particular. And the Winkle-Wagner, if perhaps African-American women would be a helpful parallel, Rochelle Winkle-Wagner's article that's on the page that I'm showing now, this perpetual homelessness article, I think is also fascinating. She talks about a program that she calls Sister Circles, where they got together and that was their safe space. It wasn't connected to a residence hall, but it certainly could be. It certainly could be an RA or an RHA kind of program where they come together and just talk about their experiences. And certainly some of the students in my study found some of those spaces through organizations that reflected their racial identity. The Black Sheep was involved in, I think, 4 different organizations for African American men, and that's who he went to, after his professor patted him on the head in class. That's who he went to when people mistook him for a football player instead of a biochemistry major, which is what he was. He'd never played football in his life, but he was in good physical shape, so people assumed that because he was Black and he was in good physical shape, he must be here on a football scholarship. And he's like, nope, I'm here on an academic scholarship. I'm studying biochemistry, and you can stop making assumptions about me right about now. Suggest getting involvement and buy-in on the faculty level. Matea, that's a fantastic question. And one way that I think could be helpful is to consider any element of your provost office that already targets diverse faculty or staff, and that may span into student affairs. I know here there is an organization, a couple of them. There's an organization for Black faculty and staff. There is a coordinator on the graduate school side for graduate students in terms of diversity. And that person I would go to as a resource to say, hey, what faculty members do you know of who really value the experiences of diverse students in general, of first-generation students in particular, and then honestly, work in some grassroots connections. I asked around when I first got here because I knew the folks in student affairs who were targeting underserved students, so financially needy students, and they already knew some folks because they'd been here for, those staff members and faculty members had been here for a long time. So I went out and got to know those faculty members, and then I asked them, who else do you know who would be interested in supporting first-generation students? I also got great connections in our libraries and had multiple colleagues who were librarians who were really interested in supporting first-gen students and who were also first-gen students themselves. So at one point we had 4 different sections of that class from a few years back that was specifically for supporting first-gen transitions, and I was not even teaching one. I would have been glad to teach one, but part of the point or part of the impact I wanted to make was to facilitate connections with faculty mentors. And so I had the librarians teaching. I had a professor from the German department teaching. I had a professor of sociology teaching. So maybe even start with, if none of those other connections are feasible on your campus, look in your sociology department. Look in your Black World Studies department. Look in some of the areas in psychology maybe where the disciplines of these faculty members are likely to overlap with some of the populations that we really want to target and value. All right. Yes, I really, really appreciate everybody sticking with us beyond the planned timing for this presentation. I appreciate this opportunity, and I hope this information was useful. And you can look me up on the Miami homepage. I don't think I included my email here, but I'm happy to connect with any of you all individually. I love, obviously, talking about some of this stuff. And I can be reached at Stoll E, so my last name, S-T-O-L-L, and E, because my real first name is Elizabeth, at miamioh.edu. But if you ever go to the Miami University website, you can just type in Buffy. I'm the Director of New Student Programs, and it will pop up easily.
Thank you so much for the presentation. This has been great information, and I hope our attendees got a lot of great takeaways from it as well. And it sounds like you had a very successful dissertation there. Just as a reminder to all of our attendees, we will make this recording available on our website shortly. I'll try to upload it this afternoon, so feel free to share it with any colleagues. Thanks again, Dr. Stoll Turton, for presenting today, and for our attendees for joining us. Have a good one.
Thank you.